The Enlightenment. So now, class, that we've finished our discussion of the scientific revolution, we're now going to move into the realm of political philosophers, the philosophes. That is to say, the French scholars of the Enlightenment. They're not actually French, but the term philosophe is a French term for philosopher, which came to denote these new philosophers of the Enlightenment period. So we're talking about some of these early philosophers, these gentlemen who particularly took an interest in the field of politics, which is going to be one of the main focuses we look at in the Enlightenment. So the first big issue is the state of nature and the origin of governments. If you look at this is an illustration from the cover of Hobbes's Leviathan. It's meant to illustrate the concept of the Commonwealth. So the first thing you'll notice is the large figure who is in the form of a king. The figure has a crown upon his brow, a sword within one hand, and a mitre in the other, and a crozier, not a mitre, a crozier in the other. However, you'll notice that the figure is made up of dozens of smaller human beings. This is meant to represent the idea of the Commonwealth, of the strength that people are imbuing into their government through the civil covenant, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So, pre-Enlightenment theories on government. So before the Enlightenment, there were three central ideas in Europe that governed how people thought about government. So one was here that government was ordained by God. This is an idea we see a lot in the Bible, where kings, even kings that did not necessarily believe in God, like Cyrus the Great of Persia, are referred to as anointed by God. So this idea very much correlates to an idea called divine right monarchy. And divine right monarchy basically is a theory that the king is the king because God chose that individual to be born into that position. Now, an alternate theory was that government was part simply of the natural order. Governments just came into existence as part of nature, the natural order of things. And that was Aristotle's position, the position of other Hellenistic philosophers. The final idea we have is that government was invested with authority, was given its authority by the church. And this was an idea suggested in the Middle Ages by papal hierocratic theory, or theories about the papal supremacy to the state. Now we get into the Enlightenment. That's the view people take of government is very different. Government is seen as invented by human beings for some purpose. That is, to provide something which was lacking in the state of nature. The state of nature is a hypothetical state of society before governments were created. So again, it doesn't actually have any connection to the actual Paleolithic. State of nature is simply what theorists, various philosophers thought this is what society was like before there was any government. Then whatever the problem was, or whatever was lacking in that society, that's the reason why human beings created governments. So Thomas Hobbes, he believed in an anarchic state of nature, an anarchy-ridden state of nature. He described it as the war of every man against every man. He said of it, life was nasty, brutish, and short. And he believed that government exists to preserve the life and safety of the governed. So in other words, he said that Hobbes believed in the state of nature. Again, it's the war of every man against every man. Every person is out for themselves. And they're trying to kill, beat up, rob anyone who gets in their way. Because of this, life's nasty. It's not a pleasant existence. You're forced to live as a brute. You're forced to be savage and brutal. And because of all the savage brutality, you don't live too long. And he says to eliminate this state, people invested. They gave all of their powers, all their personal freedoms to a government in what he called the civil covenant. And this was an unbreakable agreement between the people and the government. He held that if you broke a civil covenant, what happened was it reduced the strength of the civil covenant with later governments. So it was then made it easier for the public to declare, so if you overthrew, say, a king and replaced the king with some new government, the bond, the civil covenant between the governed and the new government was weaker because it had been forged as a result of the breaking of an earlier civil covenant. And this would only make it easier to break that civil covenant, not until eventually we descended back into the state of nature. That war of every man against every man. Now, John Locke took a different position. He didn't think the state of nature was that bad. He thought it was decent, but it was unindustrious. It was a period when people didn't really expand, they didn't really build things. And the reason for that, he said, is that there was no private property. There was no protection that ensured that someone would get to reap the fruits of their own labor. For this reason, he believed that government existed to protect life, liberty, and property. He believed in what was called the social contract, which meant that if a government cannot or will not defend those values of life, liberty, and property, then the people have the right and the duty to overthrow that government and replace it with one that will. Then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau had a whole different vibe on the state of nature. He said the state of nature was a paradise, where natural resources were shared by all. Everyone took what they needed. Everyone had as much as they could find. It was a good state. But then human beings got greedy, he said, and they wanted to claim portions of nature for themselves to create private property. And in order to enforce this new private property, they created governments and then all the evils that came with it. He would say, man rushed headlong into chains. That's the way he described it. However, he also felt that the state people were living in 18th century Europe, it was too late to go back to a state before government. It was too late. Couldn't be done. So, for better or worse, society was stuck with a government. Government was a necessary evil. However, that evil could be reduced if laws could be formed to reflect the common will. So if laws could reflect the will of the people, then that somewhat mitigated the negative impact of the existence of government. So now we've gone over what governments were, how governments came to be. Enlightenment philosophes also had opinions on how to run a government. So the Baron de Montesquieu, again, he was a French political philosopher, and he held that government was always trying to increase its own power. So he said that the best way to solve this issue is to separate the government into three branches: an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. And each branch would he believed the reason he did this is that each branch would try to gain power at the expense of the other two. And as a result, each of the other two would serve as checks on each other, right? If the executive branch is always trying to increase its power at the expense of the legislative and judicial branch, it's going to be checking the power of those branches. And likewise, the legislative and judicial branches will not only check each other, but will check the power of the executive branch, and so on and so forth. And finally, we get to Voltaire. Now, he was another Frenchman. He was a deist. Now, deism is a belief in a god based upon Newtonian physics. So, again, Isaac Newton said, right, an object in motion will stay in motion until a force acts on it. An object at rest will stay at rest until a force acts on it. And as per the observations of Galileo and the universe moving about the sun, the universe was understood to be in motion. So if things in the universe are in motion, something or someone must have set them in motion. There must have been a prime mover. This prime mover, this supreme being that created the world and set it in motion, people referred to this was a deity, it was a god. However, they didn't believe in a god that had personal relationships with worshippers or got involved in the universe other than setting it up with its natural laws and setting it in motion. Voltaire bought heavily into this idea, and he opposed all government official religion, all official state churches. He despised. He had an anti-Catholic streak. He once said, crush the Ennial thing, in reference to Catholicism. He also set up Jews as the enemy of the Enlightenment. He had very anti-Semitic tendencies. He believed that the problem with Catholicism was its superstition. And he believed that Catholicism got its superstitious elements from Judaism. So Voltaire is an important figure because as we look at the anti-Catholic sentiment in revolutionary France, and then later when we look at the increasing tide of anti-Semitism in Europe, I want you to remember Voltaire, because Voltaire is vital in setting events like that into motion through the ideas he articulated. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed our lecture on the Enlightenment.